In 1963, a small plane disappeared in the Yukon wilderness. Days turned into weeks. Search planes scoured the area but found nothing. The families prayed and held on to hope, refusing to believe the worst. Then 49 days later, against all odds, they were spotted. Helen Klaben and Ralph Flores, two strangers who barely knew each other, set out on a simple flight, and it ended up one of the greatest survival stories ever told. They survived nearly 2 months in temperatures that regularly hit 40 below zero. No real shelter, no food, and both badly injured. This is the story of who they were, how they ended up in that unforgiving wilderness, and what it took to survive against impossible odds for 49 days. Before Helen Klaben became a survival legend, she was just a kid from Brooklyn trying to find her place in the world. She was one of 6 kids squeezed into a noisy, chaotic household where money was tight and space was even tighter. And Helen? Well, she wasn't like other girls growing up in the 1950s. With 4 older brothers around, Helen had a choice: play by herself or keep up with the boys. There were no tea parties in her world. She was climbing trees, roughhousing, and showing those brothers that whatever they could do, she could do too. She would try to prove that she was just as tough as they were. And most of the time, she was. Helen had a wild imagination. She pictured herself living in the woods surrounded by wild animals that somehow became her friends. And Tarzan was her absolute hero. But in reality, she was terrified of actual animals. She'd literally cross the street if she saw a dog or even a cat coming her way. That tough exterior was hiding something else. A girl who didn't quite know where to fit in. The other girls at school were taking tap dancing lessons and piano lessons, and Helen was too busy learning how to throw a punch. And when she was 9, everything changed. Her father left, and money got even tighter for the family. The older boys started working to help the family out, and Helen found herself more on her own than ever. At school, Helen would look at the other girls with their proper lives and envied them. What she didn't realize that they were looking right back at her and envying her. She had independence and freedom, and she could take care of herself in a way that they couldn't. Later in life, she'd look back and say all those early struggles, the loneliness, the insecurity, all of it made her stronger, more independent. And as the house got louder and the money got scarcer, Helen did the only thing that she could. She grew up really fast. By 12, she was already working overnight babysitting for a couple dollars a night. Then came bookkeeping, receptionist work, photo studio gigs. She taught skating in Central Park, worked the floor at Macy's, and became a summer camp counselor. Whatever paid her, she did it. By high school, Helen had built this protective shell around her. She felt like she was watching life from the outside, never really belonging anywhere. She eventually landed a pretty decent office job in communications and actually liked the work. It was more responsibility than she'd ever had, but she had this restlessness inside of her that just kept growing and growing. And soon that old office routine, it began to get really boring. Helen got a raise on a Tuesday and handed her resignation in on Wednesday. She wanted adventure. Helen just wanted to get out there and explore the world. She wanted to see what was beyond those Brooklyn streets that she grew up on. And one day, she made a decision that would set her life on an entirely different path. She decided that she was leaving New York. She didn't know exactly where she was going to go or what she was looking for, but she knew one thing for certain, that she wasn't going to find it in New York. What she didn't know was that decision would put her on a collision course with a pilot named Ralph Flores, a small plane, and one of the most incredible survival stories ever told. One day she was looking at the paper when she found an ad about somebody looking for a travel companion to California. It felt like the universe was giving her a sign. California meant freedom, open spaces, and a completely different life. Helen was all in. For a full week, she was practically living in that future already. She packed her bags, said goodbye to coworkers and friends, and dealt with her mother, who was worried sick about her leaving. Then without warning, the whole plan fell apart. Most people would have just unpacked, settled back into their routine, and accepted the disappointment, but something had been awakened in Helen. Days later, Helen was scouring the newspaper classified ads again, and something caught her attention. This time, it was another ad. Someone named Sue was looking for a travel companion, but this time the destination was in California. It was Alaska. Alaska, she thought, not just across the country, but practically off the map. 4,000 miles from everything familiar. Her mother had mixed feelings about it. California was one thing, but Alaska, that was even further, more isolated. It was remote, wild, and unforgiving. But at the same time, her mother knew that Helen needed this, because Helen just wasn't happy. She was restless, frustrated, and searching for something. Helen needed something different. She just felt like she was sleepwalking through life. And what scared her wasn't the thought of going to Alaska, it was the thought of staying, waking up years later in the same apartment, with the same routine, wondering what might have been. A week later, she was loading up the car with Sue, and they were loading it up with camping gear, winter clothes, and everything that they thought they'd need for a trip into the north. Helen's mother gave her a big hug and tried to hold back her tears. The car pulled away and Helen didn't look back. They left on August 25, 1962. As they drove across the country, Helen imagined herself as one of the early pioneers heading into brand new territory and seeing the world for the first time. And everything about the trip fascinated her, from the big tourist attractions to something as simple as cows. They made their way north, and when they got to Whitehorse, they got their second flat tire of the trip. Helen wandered around the small Yukon city, noticing how people moved differently here, with purpose, with awareness of the environment around them. And then they arrived in Fairbanks 17 days, yes, a whopping 17 days after leaving Brooklyn. And Helen spent those 17 days on the road imagining what Alaska would be like. She pictured wild landscapes, log cabins set against snow-capped mountains, and her transforming into some kind of pioneer woman who built things with her hands and lived off the land. She even had big plans. Maybe she'd build a homestead or a lodge, a place for hunters and skiers, a business that she could start from nothing. But when she actually got there, well, Fairbanks was different. It wasn't the pristine wilderness of her imagination, but a frontier town built for function, not really beauty. And the people surprised her too. She left Brooklyn with embarrassing assumptions that everyone outside New York was a hick. Instead, she met people with advanced degrees who chose to live here, artists who found inspiration in the landscape, engineers who solved problems that city people down south never had to consider. Fairbanks was a gritty, no-frills town, where people were just trying to get through the winter. Helen had imagined adventure. Instead, she found frozen mud, long nights, and temperatures that could kill you if you weren't careful. Her first real taste of what Alaska was really like was the cold. She said it was the kind of cold that slaps you in the face the second you step outside. She didn't really understand it until she stepped outside and it felt like it burned her lungs and froze her eyelashes and made her breath hang in the air like she was smoking. This wasn't a New York winter. This was something else. She layered up and slowly she started to adjust. But even with the right gear, she found that Alaska has a way of humbling you. And boy, I have to just do a little sidebar here because can I ever relate to this story? I didn't know much about Helen's story until I started reading her book. And we have a lot of parallels in our lives, many decades apart, but still. I moved north as well, had this dream to move here into the cold. And the very first year that I was here, I was out dog sledding and I froze my earlobe. Actually, this one. Like it was frozen solid, like a chunk of ice. I actually thought it was a chunk of ice and I tried to rip it off. Whoops. I tried to rip it off until a friend stopped me and said, that's your ear you're trying to rip off. But I loved it. I loved waking up to minus 50 mornings. I don't now, but I used to love it. Stepping outside and feeling the air freeze your breath instantly. I watched kids walk to school at minus 40 like it was absolutely no big deal, like it was normal. And like Helen, I learned real fast that the cold will test you. At the time, I had to haul water to my cabin in blue jugs, and if I left them outside for a few minutes, they'd be frozen solid. I accidentally left a 6-pack of pop in my car overnight, and the next day, it exploded, and my car was covered in frozen Pepsi explosions. And then there was a time I fell in a creek up to my chest in the dead of winter. I was actually walking along the creek, and I fell through a little bit, and I thought, oh, that's weird. But I landed on an ice ledge underneath. So I kept walking on the creek. That's one lesson I learned, was never to walk on creeks after you fall through them once. But I did. I kept walking, and that's when I fell through a big hole. Luckily, the creek wasn't very deep. It was only about knee deep, but it was quite a struggle to get myself out because I was up to my chest, and there was ice everywhere. So I managed to pull myself out, and I had to walk back to my cabin. Took about 15 minutes, and my boots were frozen chunks of ice. I swear they each weighed like 50 pounds by the time I got back. But that was when I really understood what the cold could do to you if you're not careful. You simply don't mess around with it. And like I did, I started to figure it out, and so did Helen. She started to figure out how to survive in Fairbanks. People in Fairbanks were nothing like the ones she knew back home. There was no small talk, no pretentiousness, just straightforward, honest, hardworking people who had seen it all. They lived in cabins, they hauled water, split wood, and knew exactly what it took to survive. Helen had never met people like this before, and little by little, she started to feel like she belonged. And like the Yukon, any place in the north that's pretty harsh to live in, it has a way of weeding out the weak people. But if you stuck it out, and if you proved you could handle yourself, you became one of them. Helen threw herself into everything in Fairbanks. She met gold miners, bush pilots, hunters, and trappers. People who left everything behind just like she had. People who were just as lost and searching for something like her. She landed a job at a photo studio, but got bored really fast, so she quit. A friend told her about a job as a draftsman, and before she even knew what a draftsman was, she was drafting. At first she thought it was exciting, and then she realized that she hated working for the government. Her instinct was to rebel against authority, so she quit that too. And for the first time, she had her own apartment. Her first taste of real independence. And she described herself later as immaculate when I wasn't a slob, which made me laugh and made me to relate to her even more. Then in November, winter really set in and temperatures dropped to minus 47 Celsius or minus 53 Fahrenheit. And if you haven't experienced that kind of cold, let me tell you, things get weird. If you can get your car to start, your tires freeze into squares overnight, so you clunk down the road for a bit until they get thawed back into shape. If you breathe too deep, your lungs would burn. Touch metal with bare skin, and you could rip it right off. But the cold wasn't the worst part. The darkness was. But Helen found a way around it. The darker that it got, the busier she became. She really got out there. She went caribou hunting. She took a flight in a bush plane. She skated. She joined the drama club. She took a painting class, went bowling, and even tried fencing. And soon Fairbanks was changing her. She met all kinds of people and realized that she used to be really quick to judge others, but now she was learning to let that go. But by mid-January, something started creeping in, and that was that old restless feeling. Helen could not be contained. The weather was too bad to travel within Alaska, so she kind of felt stuck and she needed a change. Some of her friends were heading to Mexico, so she figured, why not? I'll go too. So once again, she quit whatever job she had at the time, packed her bags, and got ready to leave Fairbanks. She had learned a lot, but her biggest lesson was still coming, because one day she met Ralph Flores, and from that moment on, her life would never be the same. Helen planned to stay in Fairbanks until February 1st and then take a commercial flight to San Francisco. It was a simple, safe, and pretty predictable plan. Until she heard the radio announcement that said a pilot was flying to San Francisco and looking for a passenger to split costs on his small plane. And Helen was immediately intrigued because she didn't like doing things the normal way. We're soon finding out that Helen loves adventure. She'd only been in a bush plane once before when a friend had taken her over Fairbanks, and he even let her fly the plane for a little bit. And she was exhilarated, but also kind of terrified. And to take this kind of trip all the way down to San Francisco, well, that was way more exciting than sitting in a boring big commercial plane. Plus, it was also half the cost, just $70 instead of a full price ticket of $140. So she answered the ad and met Ralph. Ralph wasn't a rugged Alaskan bush pilot, not the kind of seasoned bush pilot you'd expect in the north. He was a 42-year-old mechanic, self-taught pilot, and a Californian who had spent the last year working in the north. And now he was heading home. But this flight wasn't just about getting back for Ralph. He had big plans. He wanted to start an electronics business and fly between California and Mexico selling goods. This trip was his first step towards that dream. A few years earlier, in 1960, Ralph had packed up and moved to Alaska with one goal, to bring his family there. He had 6 kids and wanted a fresh start. He was low on money and searching for work in Fairbanks when he saw a room for rent sign and moved in with a family who owned an auto shop. They gave him a job as a mechanic, and Ralph was super excited to bring his family north, but his wife, she wasn't as excited. She was not thrilled about trading San Francisco for Arctic winters. But Ralph told her, I just really feel like we need to come here. I don't know why. By then, he had converted to Mormonism and felt a strong spiritual pull to Alaska. But it didn't last. His wife and kids struggled with the cold, and eventually they moved back to California. Ralph stayed behind to keep working. And on his way home to reunite with them, that's when he met Helen. Before they left, Ralph stopped at Helen's place to check her baggage and just to make sure it wasn't too heavy for the plane. And her first impression was that he seemed intelligent, competent, and quiet. Ralph was a shorter fella with a black mustache, large glasses, and a Spanish accent. And out of nowhere, he said something strange. He said, I'm a priest in my church. Helen just nodded and thought, okay, where's he going with this? And then he told her, I think of you as an instrument of temptation to test my faith. You're an attractive young girl, and if I came near you, I'd lose my position in the church and lose the church itself. Helen was a little confused and intrigued, but also thought, he's old enough to be my father. What's with this guy? And then completely unprompted, she blurted out, I'll probably die tomorrow. She was probably just panicking because this older guy was being weird, but she had no idea why she said it. It wasn't something that she even thought about or feared. It just kind of popped out of her mouth. And Ralph told her, no, you won't die because God told me so. And then he told her that his mission was to save her. And that was a really weird way to start off this trip. I think I would have noped the heck out of there right then and there. But the weirdness doesn't end there. He also told her, don't fly with me unless you trust me, which is an interesting thing for a pilot to say just before you go on a gigantically long flight over a remote wilderness across 2 countries. And Helen didn't know anything about planes. She didn't know what questions to ask or how to tell if a pilot was experienced or a total disaster. So she consulted one of her friends who was a private pilot, and he reassured her, saying that he would go on the trip himself if the pilot was a good one. But how was Helen to know if he was a good one? She had no clue, but she decided to go anyways. She packed her bags and then left most of her warm clothing behind because why would she need winter gear in San Francisco? That's a decision she would later deeply regret. A real quick little interjection here. If you've ever wondered what happens when I'm not telling stories, well, it's mostly me wandering and frolicking about the woods with my dogs, talking to my dogs, and getting in kind of ridiculous situations. Today, I got my quad stuck as I slid off some ice on a glacier, it felt like a glacier, into some brush. And I was stuck, and it took me a good hour to try and get out. And stuff like that happens a lot. And the video I took and the story I'm going to tell from that event is 100% going into my members section. If you want extra behind-the-scenes videos, bloopers, random thoughts while out hiking around with the dogs, and me blathering about whatever nonsense pops into my head, come hang out in the members section. There's no real fancy bonus content yet, just kind of real life happening around here. The dogs, the chaos, and the stuff I probably shouldn't put on my main channel. So if you're interested, you can join the membership and come hang out. Okay, back to the story. Should she pack some sandwiches, bring some snacks? Because the trip would be about 5 days. Ralph told her, sure, if you want to, bring some food just in case. She wasn't too worried about the food. Besides, she figured that this was the perfect time to start a diet. Oh, the thinking of the 1960s. So instead of sandwiches and something, robust and healthy and filling, she packed a few apples, some oranges, and a bit of Tang. Do y'all remember Tang? Does Tang even still exist? That sugary, orangey drink? At 11:30 a.m., they took off from Fairbanks. It was cold, clear, and about minus 34 Celsius or minus 30 Fahrenheit. Ralph wore a white dress shirt and a leather jacket. He did have a big parka with him that he wasn't wearing, and he had rubber boots and wool pants. As they lifted off, Helen felt sad leaving Alaska because she hadn't seen everything that she wanted to. But as she climbed into the plane, she promised herself that she'd come back. As they took off, Ralph pointed out the lakes and the rivers below, and the plan was simple. They would follow the Alaska Highway south. Ralph didn't have an instrument rating, which meant that he could only fly using visual flight rules, and he needed to see the highway in order to follow it. They ended up getting stuck in Whitehorse for a few days, waiting for better flying conditions. And Helen was already realizing something. Her boots weren't quite right for this trip. Her feet were already freezing in Whitehorse, and they still had a long way to go. Monday, February 4th, 1963, day 3 of the trip. They were finally ready to leave Whitehorse, and their next stop was Fort St. John, BC, almost 1,000 kilometers or 600 miles away. There was fog on the ground, but the weather reports suggested that it would clear up further south. Helen stood outside waiting as Ralph refueled the plane and shifted the load. It was minus 43 degrees, and at this point, Fahrenheit and Celsius doesn't really matter. It's about the same. And she was already cold, and they hadn't even taken off yet. Finally, they were ready. Inside the plane, Helen listened as air traffic control gave instructions. But she could barely understand what they were saying. There was static, quick radio chatter, and garbled words, but she assumed that Ralph understood them. Over the radio, she caught something about a low ceiling, but wasn't exactly sure what that was. Before she had time to ask Ralph about it, the engine roared to life and they were airborne. The second they left the ground, though, Helen knew something was weird and different. Instead of climbing smoothly, the plane started circling upward in a tight spiral. She grabbed her seat and asked Ralph what the heck was going on. He barely looked over at her, but he told her that they had to spiral through the clouds to get on top. Helen was super nervous and almost felt nauseated going up in the spiral, but figured that this was just one of those things that pilots had to do. But it didn't sit well with her. And a side note, for those of you wondering, I checked with a pilot friend of mine because I have no idea if spiraling up is normal, and this is actually something that they do to get through the clouds. So Ralph knew what he was talking about here. But that spinning, it was still bothering Helen, and it seemed like it would never end. And finally, just as Ralph had said, they broke through the clouds and the sky opened up. And that was just the first scare of the day, and the next one would be much worse. The first hour of the flight was calm, and Helen was starting to relax. But then, the turbulence hit. At first, it was just a small bump or two, nothing too bad, and then it got a little bit worse, and then the plane jolted really hard. Helen felt her stomach drop as they hit one rough patch after another. For the next 2 hours, they were in and out of bad weather, dipping in and out of storm clouds. One moment they'd break into clear air, and the next they'd be thrown right back into the clouds and turbulence. And then the clouds fully closed in around them. Helen looked outside but couldn't see a thing. There was no horizon, no sky. It was just endlessly gray. She couldn't even tell what side was up or what side was down. And that's when she noticed Ralph switching the fuel tanks. She had seen him do this before. Each tank lasted about 45 minutes, and on their last flight, he had actually asked her to remind him to switch tanks, but she forgot. By the time he remembered and switched the tanks, the engines had sputtered and they dropped 1,000 feet in seconds. Now she watched again as he switched tanks, remembering that moment. And she knew that by 3 p.m. they'd be out of fuel. And looking out the window, she realized they had no idea where they were. Ralph tried to climb to 10,000 feet, hoping to break through the clouds to get a clear view of where they were. But without oxygen masks, they couldn't stay at that altitude for long, and they were forced to drop back down. Helen checked her watch. It was 2:35. Time had slowed to a crawl. Every minute felt like an hour. Ralph was hunched over the instrument panel, adjusting the controls, scanning dials, trying to pick up a navigational beam from Whitehorse to Fort St. John so he could tell where he was. But there was nothing. At 2:40, the fuel gauge started vibrating downwards. At 2:50, Helen glanced at the fuel gauge again. It was nearly empty. She didn't need Ralph to tell her what that meant. They were almost out of time. Ralph never said that they were lost, but he didn't have to. Helen could see it in his face. At 2:55, the engine started struggling. The familiar hum that had been constant for hours wavered, sputtered, and then cut in and out. Oh my gosh, just telling this makes me panic. Poor Helen. Ralph started to tighten his grip on the controls and started spiraling down again, trying to drop below the clouds and spot any kind of landmark. Helen watched as his eyes darted between the dials and the white void outside the cockpit. His hands adjusting the controls with more urgency than ever. She reached down and tightened her seatbelt, and then Ralph flipped a switch. Helen barely had time to process it before realizing that they had an auxiliary gas tank. For a brief second, she felt a wave of relief. Maybe they weren't out of fuel at all. But then nothing happened. The engine sputtered and coughed again, and then it went silent. Ralph had waited too long to switch tanks. The fuel lines were completely empty and fresh gas hadn't reached the carburetor yet. Helen felt the change immediately, and the silence was deafening. They weren't flying anymore, they were falling. For a moment, there was just silence. Then as they dropped through the storm clouds, they were no longer surrounded by gray. Instead, a dense tree-covered slope was rushing towards them. Helen felt strangely detached, like she was watching it all from outside her body. The trees whipped past them, getting closer and closer. And then, the right wing clipped a tree. Everything snapped forward, and Helen barely had time to squeeze her eyes shut before the impact. Her last thought was, what should I do with my feet? Helen wasn't sure how long she'd been unconscious. When she opened her eyes, everything was silent. She sat frozen for a moment, her mind slowly catching up, and then all of a sudden it hit her, and she thought to herself, hey, I'm alive. Well, what do you know? We did crash. And then came the pain, a deep throbbing ache in her legs, a tightness in her ribs, and a sharp sting on her face where her head slammed into something. She tried to move, but intense pain shot through her foot. Something was definitely broken. She looked down at the maps that were on her lap, and they were now covered in her blood. Her chin had split open. She turned her head and saw Ralph slumped over, motionless and covered in blood. His seat had broken off in the impact. She stared at the blood on the console, confused. She said it looked strange, almost waxy, and that's when she realized it had already frozen. She called Ralph's name, but he didn't respond. She started to panic and kept calling his name, and then finally he stirred. His voice was faint, and he mumbled something about being tired and not wanting to wake up. But he was alive, and somehow they both survived. Helen could barely look at Ralph. His face was a mess. His lips were gouged, his chin was split, his left eye was swollen and red, and his cheekbone looked shattered. He told her his jaw was broken and his ribs were too. She told him her foot and arm were broken. And yet, despite his injuries, Ralph kind of became a superhero. He pulled on his parka, dragged himself through the shattered windshield, and immediately got to work. Helen could hardly believe it. His body was wrecked, and yet there he was crawling through the snow, gathering branches, and he got a fire going right away. And then he climbed back inside to help Helen get out. And the second she got out, the cold hit her. Her legs were completely numb, and every movement sent stabbing pain through her body. Then, out of nowhere, as he was dragging her poor broken body out of the plane, he said something that made Helen's head snap up. He said, "You know why we're here, don't you? It's because you reject Jesus Christ." Helen couldn't believe her ears. She was in too much pain to argue, but she thought, what an incredible thing to say at a time like this. Jeez Louise, Ralph. That night, the temperature plunged to minus 45. The snow was up to Helen's knees, in some places up to her waist. The wind howled around them and whipped through the wreckage, and they had no idea where they were. They climbed back into the plane and pulled every piece of clothing from their suitcases, layering it over themselves, trying to trap what little body heat they had left. No matter what they did, the cold found its way in. Helen couldn't get comfortable. Every position hurt, and the freezing air seeped through everything. As she lay there shaking and shivering, she thought of her mother. By now, her mother would think that Helen was dead. More than anything, she wanted her to know that she was alive. By morning, Ralph was already up and moving around, like a man who hadn't just crashed a plane and shattered half his face. Helen watched in disbelief as he struggled to cover the broken door with a tarp. How was he even standing? His jaw was fractured, his ribs cracked, and yet he never admitted that anything was out of control. And then, as if things couldn't get more surreal, Helen watched as he set his own broken cheekbone. With his bare hands, he pushed the shattered bone back into place and wrapped his face in a sweater and let the frozen blood harden it into a cast. Helen winced just watching him, and then he turned to her and did the same thing with her arm. The sweater froze the blood, holding everything together. They spent the entire day trying to make their sleeping space more comfortable, but they were weak, freezing, and in pain. Even the smallest task that they tried exhausted them. That night, sitting by the fire, they finally took a moment to look around. They were on a mountainside surrounded by dense spruce and pine forest. The only break in the trees was where the plane had slashed through them. The wings were torn off at the fuselage, jagged and broken, and Helen just stared at the wreckage, trying to process it all. And one thought kept repeating in her head, we shouldn't have survived this. They started taking stock of what little supplies they had with them, and it didn't take long because there wasn't a lot. For food, they had 4 small cans of sardines, 2 cans of tuna, 2 cans of mixed fruit, crackers, some protein pills and multivitamins, 5 pieces of chocolate, and 2 tablespoons of good old Tang. Helen also had some chewing gum and cigarettes, a little addiction that she had. Beyond that, their gear was just basic travel stuff: matches, extra clothes, 2 mirrors, binoculars, empty oil cans, and 3 small knives. But they had no emergency rations, no flare gun, no survival equipment. Helen asked Ralph where the emergency gear was, and he told her that he hadn't brought any. He said it took up too much space and it weighed too much. And then, as if that explained everything, he said, "A lot of pilots don't carry survival equipment." Helen just stared at him. Well, that would have been one of the questions she could have asked him early on, before she hopped on the plane. Later, she would say that she didn't blame him, that she had taken her own chances. But in that moment, she was kind of pissed. That night, as they sat around the fire, a new sound broke through the silence. At first, it was faint, a distant and mechanical sound drifting in and out. The sound reminded Helen of something, but she couldn't quite tell what. And then it hit her. It sounded like garbage trucks back in Brooklyn. She looked at Ralph, and he'd heard it too. Neither of them could exactly tell what it was, but for the first time there was something out there beyond the trees. Maybe it meant civilization wasn't too far away. Ralph turned his attention back to the radios. They were in rough shape. They could broadcast, but not receive, so all they could do was send signals into the void and hope that somebody was listening. Then, out of nowhere, another odd noise. This time, it was a plane. Helen's head snapped up. She couldn't see it, but the low hum of the engine was unmistakable. Ralph scrambled to the fire, grabbing green wood and throwing it onto the flames, hoping the smoke would be seen from above. Helen grabbed the radio and pressed the button, yelling, "Mayday, Mayday!" The sound of the plane grew louder, and then it was directly overhead. They watched, waiting for any sign that it had seen them. They scanned the sky, waiting for the moment that it would circle back, but the plane never slowed down. It didn't turn and didn't tilt its wings in acknowledgement of seeing them. Helen watched as it disappeared into the distance. On day 3, reality set in. Whatever optimism Helen had been clinging to, she just lost and slumped forward. She was exhausted, and suddenly she was crying, really crying for the first time since the crash. The reality of the situation was hitting her hard. And for the first time, she felt something she hadn't noticed before. She was starving. More planes passed overhead that day, but none of them saw the smoke, and none of them picked up their distress calls. Ralph did his best to keep her calm and assure her that the search wouldn't stop until they were found. But despite his own injuries, Ralph kept working. He splinted Helen's arm using pieces of the plane and tore up a dress for bandages. And then with nothing but a hammer and chisel, he started cutting down trees, hacking away at the trunks with determination. Helen, watching from where she sat near the fire, just shook her head. It almost looked like he was chewing through the trees. They still believed that rescue would come soon, so neither of them were really careful with the food. Helen ate pretty freely, knowing they had enough for at least a few days. And Ralph, on the other hand, he could barely sip the juice from the canned fruit. His face was too swollen to chew, and every attempt to swallow seemed to send fresh pain through his jaw. Outside, the temperature remained a brutal -40, holding steady all week. Helen was hungry, cold, and exhausted, but instead of letting it take over, she did something that, looking back, even she admitted was completely absurd. She started exercising. Her broken body, broken foot, she started doing knee bends because at the time, for some reason, it made complete sense to her that rescue was coming soon and she wanted to look good when she got out. She didn't want to look like, she'd been in a plane crash. Later, she would actually laugh about it, but in those first few days, it gave her something to focus on that just wasn't about waiting. Ralph, who had 6 kids, including 2 16-year-old twin daughters, started to slip into this paternal role with Helen. And it kind of annoyed her at first, but it was also strangely reassuring. He called her daughter so often that once she tried calling him dad, but it felt kind of weird, so instead she called him Daddy-O. And they couldn't have been more different. Ralph was quiet, serious, deeply religious, and completely uninterested in fun things like dancing, socializing, or even drinking. Helen, on the other hand, was restless and high energy and always looking for something to do. But in a strange way, their differences kind of made them this unlikely but really effective team. To pass the time, Helen read Robert Service, the poet laureate of the Yukon, while Ralph pored over his religious books that he had with him. And when they weren't reading, they argued. A lot. Religion was the main thing that they argued about, and neither was willing to back down. But in a way, the debates kind of helped pass the time, too. By day 10, their food was gone. By day 12, Helen had searing stomach pains. For a brief moment, she wondered if this was what it was like to starve to death. But just as quickly as that thought crept in, she snapped herself out of it, telling herself that she was almost as fat as the day we crashed. Her sense of humor, no matter how grim, never really disappeared. They drank hot water in the mornings, pretending it was coffee or hot milk, and at dinner they'd sit around the fire imagining different flavors of soup. One day, Helen finally unwrapped the bandages on her foot, and there was a massive blister stretched across her toes, and the skin had turned black, except for the middle 2 toes, which were a deep purple. She figured it was just a bruise, something that would heal with time, but it wasn't. Ralph didn't say a word, and he knew better, that her toes were dead, and there was nothing they could do about it. As they sat in the wreckage staring out at the same endless trees they'd seen for days, Helen finally turned to Ralph and asked the question that had been gnawing at her since the crash. She said, "Are you sure people know we're missing?" He reassured her and told her yes, that he had filed a flight plan and that as soon as they failed to arrive in Fort St. John, search teams would be out looking for them. It made sense to Helen. Planes didn't disappear without somebody noticing. She asked if they would be easy to spot from the air, and again Ralph sounded confident. He said that they'd slice through the treetops on the way down, leaving a long scar through the forest, and any plane flying overhead would see it and send help. Helen wanted to believe him, but as the days dragged on with no sign of rescue, doubt started creeping in. Days later, Ralph decided they needed to do something. They couldn't just sit and wait. The planes kept flying overhead, but obviously they weren't able to see them, so they needed a better signal. Helen had some paint with her, so Ralph made a massive SOS sign, and then he did something that made Helen's stomach turn. He climbed up a 60-foot tree to tie up the sign, hoping a passing plane would see it. Helen couldn't believe it. Had he lost his mind? This man had a broken jaw, cracked ribs, frostbitten fingers and toes. His body was wrecked, but there he was climbing like his life depended on it, and, well, it probably did. But as Helen watched nervously as he made his way up the tree, gripping branches with hands that had long lost feeling, she held her breath, silently praying that he wouldn't slip. It felt like an eternity before he finally climbed back down, exhausted but satisfied. The sign was up. Now all they could do was wait. As the days stretched on, hunger took over every thought. Helen started dreaming of food, plates of steaming hot meals, thick slices of bread, butter melting into every crevice. She could almost taste it. The hunger wasn't just uncomfortable anymore, it was all-consuming. The worst part was that the food was actually all around them. Rabbits. There were so many rabbits, and they darted through the snow just a few feet away, little furry bundles of pure survival. Helen and Ralph watched them, knowing exactly what those rabbits meant. That was food. But watching food isn't the same as catching it. So Ralph was desperate and tried everything. He carved a spear and threw it at the rabbits, but kept missing. He built a slingshot and aimed it at them, but every rock he used and found was uneven, jagged, and it shot off in all the wrong directions and never in the direction of the rabbits. Helen watched as he set snares around their small clearing, and she shook her head because the traps weren't even in the right places. They weren't even where the rabbits were walking. And she told him this, but he didn't listen. So instead of eating, they just sat there starving and staring at the rabbits while the rabbits stared right back at them. If anything, the rabbits were the real survivors here. Ralph was determined to move through the deep snow, so he decided to build himself a pair of snowshoes. Helen watched as he carefully cut these strips of wood, bending and shaping them into something he thought would work. The second he showed her the finished product, she could tell they were way too long and narrow. And she warned him about that, trying to explain that the design was wrong and that he wouldn't spread his weight properly in the snow. But Ralph wouldn't take her advice, and the second he stepped on them, and went into the deep snow. He sunk like a rock. Helen tried not to laugh as Ralph let out a sigh, muttered something under his breath, and went back to making another pair that was wider. 3 weeks after they crashed, on February 25th, they saw a small Cessna come buzzing low over top of them. Helen's heart exploded in her chest and she said, "This is it, this is it." They leapt up, waving their arms, screaming at the sky, doing everything they could to make themselves visible. Helen was sure the pilot had seen them, and they hugged, already imagining the rescue team arriving with warm blankets and real food, and finally going home. They sat back down in the snow and waited. An hour passed, and then 2 hours passed, and then the sun started to dip. The plane wasn't coming back. Days went by, and the realization settled over them that the search was over, and no one was looking anymore. A week after the last plane had passed, the weather finally changed. The skies cleared, and while it never got super warm, it was warm enough that they could take off their jackets during the day. The shift in weather didn't change their situation, but it made things feel different. The sun lasted a little longer in the sky, the fire burned a little brighter, and for the first time since the crash, their routine felt almost normal. They woke up every morning at 9 a.m., and Ralph would start the fire. He'd heat up their water for the day, and they'd sit together imagining this gigantic breakfast of eggs, bacon, and fresh orange juice. And yet, as the days passed, Ralph became more and more fixated on something else. That sound. The one they'd been hearing on and off for weeks. The deep mechanical grind that drifted through the trees every so often. At first, neither of them could place it, but now that the planes had stopped coming, Ralph was convinced. It wasn't a plane, it wasn't the wind, it was an engine. And where there was an engine, there was people. He was sure of it now, and he just needed to follow that sound. The problem was they were still trapped in the dense forest and had no idea how far away it was. He realized that the SOS signal that he put in the trees wasn't being seen from the air. And when he climbed that tree, he had spotted a river in the distance and thought if there is a river, then there's maybe a chance that it led to a highway or some kind of road. So Ralph made a decision. He was going to go find that sound, and even if he didn't reach it, he would at least make it to a wider open area where a plane might have a chance of spotting him. The night before he left, they tried to sew together a sleeping bag for him to take with him, using insulation from the plane. Helen had a sewing kit that her mother insisted she had taken on the trip, and for once she was glad she listened. But when they finished, the sleeping bag was too big and heavy to carry. Instead, they settled on using some blankets and insulation, bundling Ralph up as best they could. And just before leaving, Ralph gave Helen detailed instructions. He told her where he was going and what she should tell the rescuers when they arrive. Helen nodded, but Ralph hesitated, looking at her seriously, and said, "You're going to be rescued soon, and just don't forget about me." Helen looked him right in the eye and said, "I would never let that happen." And then without another word, he turned and disappeared into the trees. The day after Ralph left, the wind picked up and the temperatures plunged. Helen curled deeper into the sleeping bag that they had made, and she was surprised to realize that for the first time since the crash, she was actually warm. The insulation trapped the heat better than anything they had tried before, and for a moment she felt almost comfortable. And then it hit her. If they had only thought of this weeks ago, we could have saved ourselves so much suffering. But that wasn't the only realization creeping in. For the first time in her life, she was completely alone. She'd always imagined solitude like this would be terrifying, being cut off from everything, surrounded by nothing but snow and silence. But as she sat there in the wreckage, staring out at the vast, empty wilderness, what she actually felt was something entirely different. And that was peace. She pulled out a Robert Service book, flipping through the book until a particular poem caught her attention. It was about a man who had survived the Yukon's brutal winters in far worse shape than she was. She read the words out loud. "Look at my eyes, been snowblind twice. Look where my foot half gone, and that gruesome scar on my left cheek where the frost fiend bit to the bone." Her eyes drifted to her own foot, hesitating for a second before unwrapping the bandages. The skin was even darker now, and worse, it was starting to smell. She quickly covered it back up and forced herself to keep reading, and the last stanza hit her the hardest. It said, "This is the law of the Yukon, that only the strong shall thrive, that surely the weak shall perish and only the fit survive." She stared out into the fire, letting the words sink in. She knew she was injured and she knew things were going to get worse, but what surprised her most was the complete absence of fear. She thought, I suppose I should be scared, but I'm not. For 8 days, Helen waited for Ralph. She read, she slept, stared at the sky, and listened to the fire. At 3 p.m. on the 8th day, she was inside the plane reading when she heard a sound outside. First, she thought she imagined it, but then she heard it again. A voice, faint and distant, but unmistakable. She threw her book aside and scrambled to look out the window. A voice came in again, closer this time, and it was Ralph. Relief crashed over her so suddenly that she nearly fell over. She shoved the wreckage door open and stumbled outside, ignoring the stabbing pain in her foot. She couldn't see him yet, but she could hear him calling through the trees. For 30 agonizing minutes, she stood there waiting, barely breathing. Then finally, through the bush, he appeared. Before she could stop herself, she ran, or at least stumbled, as fast as she could with her injured body and threw her arms around him, laughing and crying at the same time. He looked smaller now. His clothes were hanging off of him and his face was more gaunt, but his eyes were bright, filled with something she hadn't seen in weeks. And that was hope. He hadn't made it to that sound, but he had found something even more important. A clearing, a huge, wide-open clearing where they could see the entire sky. If they moved there, any plane flying over would have no choice but to see them. Helen didn't even hesitate. They were moving. The clearing wasn't far, maybe 2 miles, Ralph guessed, but distance meant nothing when your body was barely holding itself together. They built a makeshift toboggan to carry supplies with Ralph pushing from behind while Helen hobbled in front, dragging herself forward one agonizing step at a time. The snow was deep, the terrain was brutal. There were fallen logs which forced them to crawl over them, tangled branches, and they struggled through the deep snow. Helen could keep her feet moving, but if she stopped, she couldn't pick up her injured foot again. So Ralph had to come up behind her and physically lift her leg and set it forward so she could start moving again. She felt absolutely useless and helpless, but she kept going. Every few minutes, her makeshift canvas bindings on her feet would unravel, leaving them bare against the ice, and Ralph again would have to stop, retie them for her, and so they could start up again. It was step by step and hour by hour. By the time they finally reached the new campsite, it was almost midnight. Helen collapsed onto her knees in the snow, and before she could stop herself, she threw up. Her entire body was shutting down from exhaustion. Ralph, somehow still moving because he was kind of a machine, built a small shelter near the fire, and although Helen kind of hated this camp at first, she quickly realized how much warmer and more comfortable it was than the previous frozen plane wreckage. But the move had made her injuries worse. Her foot, which had been getting steadily more painful, was now unbearable, and that smell was stronger. It was a horrible odor that she just couldn't ignore anymore. For the first time since the crash, she forced herself to really look at her foot. She slowly unwrapped the bindings and stared in horror. The bone was sticking through the back of her foot. For a moment, she was convinced her toes were just going to fall right off right there. But she knew she just wasn't injured. She was in desperate trouble. So Ralph wasn't quite done yet. He was convinced that if he could just reach this bigger clearing by the lake, that they would be in an even better position to be spotted. So Helen watched him prepare again as he got ready to leave. And that sound, the mechanical grinding that had haunted them for weeks, it seemed closer than ever now. And Ralph was determined to find it. On March 20th, he left for the second time. It took him 6 hours to reach the clearing, only to realize that it wasn't a clearing at all, but a frozen swamp, but that's just as good. He stamped out this enormous SOS in the snow. Each letter was about 75 feet long. He wanted to make sure that it could be seen from the sky. And then he stamped out an arrow pointing straight towards the camp. That night, he curled up on a bed of spruce boughs and tried to sleep. The next morning, he started walking toward that noise, and at one point, he was desperate for any kind of landmark to see, so he climbed a 75-foot tree, and it was kind of useless because all he could see was just trees everywhere, and that climb took everything out of him. He was so exhausted he slept for the rest of the day and through the whole night. The next morning, Ralph got moving again, and he was crossing a frozen creek when he heard this sound of an engine overhead and looked up to see a plane. Frantically, he pulled out his mirror and started signaling, flashing the sun's reflection toward the sky. And the plane circled him once, and then twice, and then it turned and flew away. Ralph just stood there staring and wondering if it had seen him. Was help coming finally? Back at camp, Helen was tending to her fire when she heard the plane. She grabbed a bundle of pine and threw it onto the flames, hoping the thick smoke would rise high enough to be noticed. And then she pulled out her own mirror and angled it towards the sky. And the plane circled her twice. She stared up into the sky and thought, for sure they saw me. They had to have seen me. She just sat there waiting, her eyes locked on the sky, and then the plane flew away. She stood there staring at the sky, confused. It must have seen me. Why did it circle twice? 9 days after the search was called off, Chuck Hamilton was flying over the Yukon wilderness when he saw something. Chuck ran the BC Yukon charter flying service out of Watson Lake and was on a routine flight with a hunting guide when he noticed an SOS carved in the snow. He pointed it out to his passengers and asked if they saw it too, and they did. But in the Yukon, that wasn't necessarily unusual. Local First Nations people sometimes left signals for passing pilots when they needed supplies or assistance. But still, something seemed different about this one. And that's when Chuck saw the snowshoe tracks. Most snowshoes left a distinct pattern in the snow, but these snowshoe tracks were odd. He could tell they were homemade, rough, and uneven. So Chuck followed them, trailing the footprints through the trees, and that's when he saw the flashing mirror. And a figure hunched over, barely moving, down in the snow. And that was Ralph. At first, Chuck thought that he might just be a trapper or someone out hunting, but knew something was off. The man was curled over and gripping his stomach almost like he was in pain. Chuck banked the plane, swinging around again towards the smoke rising in the distance, and that's when Helen was doing everything she could to get his attention. She actually created so much smoke he couldn't even see her through it, but he knew something was going on there. Eventually, the smoke dissipated and he could see something else, the aircraft identification numbers, and his stomach dropped. Chuck realized that he was staring at the survivors of the lost plane. He couldn't believe it. Helen and Ralph were alive. Chuck wiggled the plane's wings to signal that he had seen them, and Helen saw it, and then he turned and flew away. For Helen, it was the best sight of her life, obviously, and she just started crying. After 49 days in the wilderness, someone had finally seen them. Chuck immediately tried to radio Watson Lake Airport but couldn't get through, so he needed help fast. He turned back toward Ralph, circling over him again before landing on a frozen lake near a trapper's cabin. And that cabin was the source of the noise that they had heard for so long. It had just been 12 miles or 19 kilometers away the entire time. The trappers had been out there the whole time, chainsaws roaring, completely unaware that 2 injured plane crash survivors were just beyond the trees. Chuck ran to them and explained the situation. Within minutes, the trappers jumped onto a dog sled and headed out to find Ralph. Chuck wanted to go straight back for Helen, but it was starting to get dark and flying at night was too dangerous. He was frustrated, but knew that it was the safest call, so he flew back to Watson Lake and alerted the RCMP. That night, Helen went to sleep hoping it would be her last night in the wilderness. As Helen slept under the Yukon stars that last night, a special bulletin interrupted television broadcasts back in Brooklyn. It said the survivors of the missing Yukon plane have been found. Helen's neighbors saw the news and immediately grabbed the phone. Within minutes, Helen's entire family knew she was alive. Her mother, overwhelmed with relief, burst into tears. Chuck Hamilton barely slept that night, knowing that Helen was still out there all alone. At first light, he was back in the air, heading straight for her. At 6:30 a.m., Helen heard the buzz of an engine, and then more planes. And then a whole bunch of people began emerging from the woods, including Chuck Hamilton. Helen looked at him, a tall, fair-haired, quiet-spoken guy, only 32 years old. He'd only been a licensed pilot for about a year. Helen cried and hugged everyone, ecstatic that this was finally over. Chuck told her that he hadn't been involved in the initial search because he'd been out of town when the plane disappeared, but he'd been keeping his eyes open ever since he got back. And as it turned out, he had flown over them 3 or 4 times before without ever seeing them. If Ralph hadn't moved them to the clearing, Chuck admitted he would have never seen them. Helen was convinced that they would have made it to spring, though, but she was also relieved that they didn't have to find out. Chuck told her that Ralph was safe, and she was relieved. They were both safe now. And then Chuck told her something else, that the rescue plane was 3 miles away and they had to walk there. But he was going to carry her. And Helen, who still thought herself as a gigantic whale laughed at him and said, "There's no way you can carry me. I'm massive." She was 100 pounds at the time because she had lost so much weight. And he said, "If I can carry a moose out of the woods, I can carry you." So with that, he threw her onto his back. And they walked back to the plane. And it was actually a pretty brutal walk because it was still that deep snow and fallen trees. And Chuck fell a million times, but he made sure to fall forward so he wouldn't fall on Helen. It took a while, but they finally made it to the plains. And the weather had actually warmed up a lot to around +1 Celsius or 35 Fahrenheit. But by the next morning, it would plummet again to -40. They had gotten out just in time. At the trapper's cabin, Helen finally saw Ralph sitting by the fire, smiling at her. They had made it. Someone handed her a moose steak sandwich. There was no easing back into eating after almost starving to death back then, and Helen devoured it, but that act of just eating completely exhausted her. The next day, they were flown out to Watson Lake, and Helen finally got to speak to her mother. And all she could say over and over again was, "I'm alive." She lost 40 pounds in 49 days, and when a reporter asked about it, she said, "What a great diet I've discovered." Helen kept her sense of humor fully intact, so much that one newspaper headline read that she threw out one-liners left and right and said, "I have no boyfriend. If I did, I wouldn't be here." Helen Klaben had survived, against all odds. Helen spent 3 days in the White Horse Hospital, where doctors told her that she would need to have all the toes on her right foot amputated. Until that moment, it hadn't fully hit her that her toes were dead. The frostbite had turned into gangrene, and she was lucky. The infection had stopped just short of spreading into healthy tissue. If it had spread, she might have lost her whole foot, or worse. Despite everything, when reporters asked how she felt about her toes, she just shrugged and threw up her hands and said that, "Hey, I'm still alive," which became the title of her book. News of their survival spread fast. Reporters from all over the world swarmed the hospital, desperate for interviews. Helen had no idea what was coming, and the attention was intense. She said it was a very strange way to become famous, just because we lived. And Ralph was recovering well. His broken jaw had healed surprisingly well. His cheekbone was back in the right place, and all he had left was a small scar above his lip. He needed some dental surgery, and he was malnourished, but otherwise okay. Helen couldn't believe how much he had shrunk. He lost 58 pounds. As she was leaving, Ralph looked her in the eye and said, "Remember what you have to do." Helen knew exactly what he meant. He wanted her to study religion, to find faith. She realized that after 53 days with this man, she still really didn't understand him at all. She leaned down and kissed him on the cheek and said, "Goodbye, Daddy-O." Helen finally made it back to Brooklyn, where she was overwhelmed with relief to see her family. For the first time in months, she wasn't fighting, freezing, or starving. She was just home, and she finally felt calm. She had surgery to amputate those toes, and in classic Helen fashion, she was awake for the surgery the entire time. Not only that, she was annoyed that they put up a screen to block her view. She wanted to watch her own surgery, her own toes being amputated. She's a different breed, that Helen. So because she can watch, she just asked the doctors for updates and a play-by-play of them cutting off her toes. Her arm healed. It was a little crooked, but it still worked, and she wasn't going to complain. Everyone kept asking Helen the same questions. What kept you alive? What did you learn from the experience? She didn't have simple answers, saying there was no magic ingredient, no single reason. And she wanted to be clear, she did not survive because of Ralph's strength and his Bible. It was more complicated than that. She said her survival came from everything that had shaped her life up to that moment. Her experiences, her independence, and her ability to adapt. She was shocked to realize that when death was right in front of her, she didn't fear it. She learned she could control her fear of darkness, of animals, and of the unknown. She let go of judgment, stopped trying to change people, and learned to accept them for who they were. Helen even admitted that in some ways the experience felt religious, but she didn't convert, she didn't change her beliefs, and she stayed true to herself. In the end, she said her story wasn't just a survival tale, it was an adventure. Not just the trip to Alaska, not just the crash, but her entire life. And she wasn't done yet. The FAA revoked Ralph's pilot license after an investigation found more than a dozen violations. He had no emergency equipment, he took off without clearance, he admitted he didn't understand the air traffic controller's instructions, and flew into conditions beyond his training, and he ran out of gas. But Ralph got his license back in 1966 and resumed flying. His family never lost hope when he was missing. The crash changed all of their lives. To them, Ralph's survival was proof of his faith. When he returned home, he worked as an electrician and eventually ran his own gas station. Years later, he was officially recognized as a hero by Congress, and Helen and Ralph kept in touch. He died in 1997 at age 75, and he told his wife just before he passed away to not ever forget Helen. Helen's life wasn't just defined by the survival story. According to her family, she went on to live a full, unconventional life. She married, had 2 sons, 6 grandchildren. She wrote a memoir in 1964, was featured in Life magazine, and even had a fantastic TV movie made about her that you can watch on YouTube. It's called Hey, I'm Alive, with Sally Struthers and Ed Asner. In 1996, she returned to Whitehorse for the first time in over 30 years. She walked into the Whitehorse Star newspaper office and said, "How can I come back and not say hello to everybody?" She said she'd always have fond feelings for Whitehorse and Watson Lake. And when someone asked if the return was traumatic, she just laughed and said, "I never thought of it that way. I always feel pretty lucky to have had the experience. It was so intense, like nothing you can imagine, and yet I survived. I always think of myself as having put my toes across the threshold of death." Helen took up triathlon racing in her late 40s, and she didn't dwell on the past. She just kept moving forward. Decades later, a young pilot named Bob Cameron, who had been 17 at the time of the crash, helped Ralph's family locate the wreckage. In 1998, they hired a helicopter and flew into the Yukon wilderness, landing high on a cliff above the crash site. Bob found the nose of the plane buried deep in the ground like a spear. Ralph's son, Frank, collected pieces of the plane, including the 450 horsepower engine and his father's toolbox. They even found rusted tins of sardines, tuna, and the can of motor oil that Ralph and Helen had used to melt snow for water. And up in the tree, that SOS signal Ralph had tied there 35 years earlier. Frank was only 5 years old when his father crashed, and he had grown up hearing the stories about the crash, but seeing the wreckage in person was an odd feeling that he wasn't prepared for. He was a pilot for American Airlines and had one dream: to restore his father's plane and finish the flight from Whitehorse to Fort St. John. He estimated it would take $150,000 in years of work. Helen stayed in touch with the family about the project, and when Frank told her about his plan, she didn't hesitate and said, "If you get it flying again, I'll go to Alaska with you." Of course she would. Helen was always looking for adventure. I don't know how many people would want to fly that route again. And I wasn't able to find anything on Frank getting the plane running again or flying it back to Alaska, so I don't think it ever happened. In 2018, after a long illness, Helen passed away at the age of 76. Her life was full, that's for sure, unconventional and adventurous, just as she wanted it to be. And if she had any message for the world, it was simple. She said to love life. Now, before we wrap this up, I've got a few final details that kind of put this whole story into perspective. They were actually 80 kilometers or 50 miles away from the highway, so much further than they thought. And the exact mountain that they crashed on was the last one rising out of the valley floor. If they had been able to glide just 20 miles in any direction, they would have landed in a wide open meadow and probably would have been spotted like within days. So close, yet so far. And if you're wondering, do pilots carry more survival supplies today than they did in the past in case you're going to take a bush plane somewhere in the Yukon wilderness? Well, thankfully the answer is yes. Yes, they do. Pilots in the north are much better prepared than Ralph was. They carry 7-day survival kits, satellite devices, and even firearms. And nowadays, a plane disappearing like Ralph and Helen's just wouldn't happen. Huge thanks to my friend Christy for helping me understand some of this flying stuff and sharing that information with me because she flies in the north a lot. So check out her channel if you want to see something about off-grid life in northern BC. So let me know, if you were in Helen and Ralph's position, how do you think you would fare in the Yukon wilderness for 49 days? Would you have just given up after day 3 in minus 40 weather? It would have been tempting, that's for sure. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.